Anthony's eyes, dark as rich as soil before a storm, locked onto Clara's. The air in the room, previously warmed by the fireplace, suddenly turned icy, heavy. "Answer me," he growled, his voice low, cutting. "What do you want here? What have you done to this place, to my people, to me?" Each word was an accusation, a wall he was building up again, stronger than ever. "Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart." Hilltop Ranch, nestled deep in the heart of the American West, lived under a nearly religious silence. It wasn't a silence of peace, but one of respect, and especially of fear. The owner of those lands, Anthony, was a man who seemed to have been sculpted by the very harshness of the untamed frontier. Tall, with broad shoulders and a face rarely softened by a smile, he commanded his domains with the same firmness with which he held the reins of a wild mustang. A widower for over a decade, ever since life snatched Helen, his wife, from him, he had closed himself off from the world, transforming the ranch into a reflection of his own arid soul. The ranch hands, who had known him since he was a boy, could read the storms in his eyes and learn to walk on tiptoes, speak in whispers, and avoid the owner's gaze. Even the sun seemed to ask permission to rise over Hilltop Ranch that afternoon. The sun was high overhead, mercilessly baking the dry earth. In the center of the main corral, a spectacle of raw power unfolded. Gale, a newly bought sorrel stallion, reared, whinnied, spun on its hind legs, refusing to accept the saddle. Sweat gleamed on its dark coat, and white foam dripped from its mouth. Anthony, his linen shirt clinging to his body with effort, did not yield. He didn't use the whip to wound, but cracked it in the air, a dry, authoritative sound that should have been enough to subjugate the animal. But Gale was not like the others. It had a fire in its eyes, a fury that seemed to mirror the man trying to tame it. The cowboys watched from a distance, leaning against the fence, not daring to intervene. They knew this was a personal duel between the boss and the beast. It was at this moment of maximum tension, when the horse reared once more, threatening to flip over, that a figure appeared on the dusty road that bordered the property. It was a young woman. She walked slowly, with the weary gait of someone who had walked for miles. She wore a simple dress, faded by the sun, and carried nothing more than a cloth bundle tied to her back. Her long brown hair flew loose, untroubled by the wind. She stopped by the fence, observing the scene in the corral. Her eyes, of a disconcerting serenity, did not fix on the man, but on the desperate animal. Without asking permission, without seeming to notice Anthony's intimidating presence or the astonishment of the other men, she slipped under the barbed wire fence and entered the corral. She walked slowly, with a calm that seemed utterly out of place amidst such chaos. Anthony, surprised by the intruder's audacity, paused for an instant, the whip still in the air. "Get out of here, young woman. This is no place for you," he ordered, his voice harsher than he intended. She didn't answer with words. She just continued to approach, her hand extended, palm up, in a gesture of peace. She began to hum a low, wordless melody, a soft sound barely audible above the horse's snorts. Gale, who until then had known only force and command, stopped. Its ears twitched toward that new sound, that gentle presence. It still trembled, but its fury seemed to drain away. The young woman came closing enough to touch the animal's muzzle. Her hand was light, her touch, a tenderness the horse seemed to recognize from somewhere deep, instinctive. It finally lowered its head and let out a long sigh, as if surrendering the fight. The silence that followed was dense, heavy. The ranch hands exchanged glances, bewildered. Anthony lowered his arm, the whip falling inertly beside his body. He looked at the young woman, at the horse now dorsal under her touch, and a sensation he hadn't felt in years washed over him: perplexity. He was a man of certainties, of strength, of control. That scene challenged everything he knew. That young woman, frail and dusty, had achieved in seconds what his brute force hadn't in an hour. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice still harsh, but with a hint of curiosity he couldn't hide. "My name is Clara," she replied, without taking her eyes off the horse, which was now rubbing its head against her shoulder. "I'm just passing through. I'm looking for work, in exchange for food and a place to sleep." Anthony sized her up. Distrust was his natural state. The world had wounded him too deeply for him to trust strangers, especially someone who appeared out of nowhere and calmed his demons with a simple touch. But there was something in her gaze, a steadfastness, a transparency that didn't align with malice. He thought of sending her away, of saying there was no work for her here, but the words wouldn't come out. The image of her, small and serene, before the enormous sorrel, was etched in his mind. "Ben," he called, without taking his eyes off Clara. The foreman, a middle-aged man, loyal and as reserved as his boss, approached. "Take the young woman to the barn. She can spend the night there. Tomorrow we'll see what to do." He turned his back and left the corral, without waiting for a reply, leaving behind a calm horse, a mysterious young woman, and a trail of questions hanging in the air. That night, sitting in his leather armchair in the dark parlor of the main house, Anthony couldn't shake the image of those serene eyes from his mind. For the first time in a long time, the order of his world had been shaken, not by a storm or a plague, but by a whisper, and he, the Iron Man, felt a fissure in his armor. The next morning at Hilltop Ranch dawned like all the others, cold, silent, and orderly. The first rooster's crow was the signal for life to stir, but always in a restrained, almost choreographed manner. The ranch hands emerged from their cabins and headed to their posts without much chatter. The smell of brewed coffee and burning wood mingled with the damp morning air, but something was missing. The sound that accompanies life when it truly lived. The sound of laughter, of carefree conversations, of a casual tune escaping one's lips. Anthony, as usual, was already up before sunrise. He passed through the kitchen to grab his mug of bitter coffee and found an unexpected scene. There was Clara. Somehow she had found an old apron, Kime haphazardly around her waist, and was helping Mrs. Lerds, the white-haired cook, who had been on the ranch since before he was born. The young woman's face was illuminated by the steam rising from a pot on the wood-burning stove, and she smiled as she listened to some story the old woman was telling. "Good morning, boss," Mrs. Lerds said, with her usual respect, but with a different sparkle in her eyes. Clara just nodded, a shy gesture, as if asking permission to be there. Anthony didn't reply. He simply took his mug and retreated to the porch, as he always did. But, from his rocking chair, he couldn't focus on the first rays of sun painting the horizon. He listened. For the first time in years, the kitchen wasn't just a functional walk space. There was the sound of Clara's voice, low and soft, asking Lerds questions about the chickens, about the bread baking in the oven. There was the cook's restrained laughter, a laugh he hadn't heard in so long he'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. He had decided he would send her away that morning. He didn't need more people on the ranch, and certainly didn't need a mysterious stranger who disarmed horses and invaded his kitchen. But hearing those sounds, something stopped him. That wasn't disorder. It was life. A life he himself had been so careful to stifle. As the days passed, Clara's presence began to spread across the ranch like a fresh breeze. She didn't ask for much, didn't impose her will, but her way of being was, little by little, becoming contagious. Anthony assigned her to help with general household duties, a way to keep her close, under his watchful eyes. He watched her from afar, from his office window, as she hung the sheets on the clothesline, and, to his astonishment, he heard her sing. They were simple melodies, lullabies or work songs she must have learnt on her travels. Her voice wasn't powerful, but it was in tune, and filled with a sweetness that seemed to cling to the leaves of the trees. The other ranch hands, initially as distrustful as their boss, soon succumbed to her kindness. She talked to the cowboys about the horses, not with the arrogance of one who knows, but with the curiosity of one who wants to learn. She petted the hounds, which normally only responds to Anthony, and they wagged their tails for her. Even the garden flowers, which for so long seemed to have given up on blooming vigorously, appeared more colorful. Ben, the foreman, was the only one who watched her with a reserve that bordered on hostility. For him, the order of Hilltop Ranch was clear. The boss commanded, he executed, the others obeyed. Clara's arrival broke that logic. She didn't fit into the hierarchy of fear. She moved through all spaces with a freedom no one else dared to possess. One afternoon, Anthony saw her sitting on the threshold of the ranch chapel, a small adobe building that hadn't been opened since Helen's funeral. She didn't try to enter. She was just there, in silence, watching the sunset. The image deeply disturbed him. That was a sacred place, a sanctuary of his grief. Her presence there felt like a desecration. He marched towards her, ready to reprimand her, to tell her that place was forbidden. But when he got close, he saw that she wasn't idle. She held in her lap a bird's nest that had fallen from an oak tree. With infinite delicacy, she used a piece of thread and a needle to mend the nest, trying to reconstruct the small home of twigs. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice more controlled than the feeling boiling within him. Clara startled, but didn't drop the nest. "It fell from the oak, sir. The fledglings are still inside, scared. I'm trying to fix it to put it back." Anthony looked at the small tangle of twigs in her hands and then at her face, concentrated on the task. There was a purity in that gesture, a need to care, to mend what was broken, that completely disarmed him. The anger that had brought him there dissipated, replaced by an even greater confusion. He, who had spent the last years breaking everything around him, saw in that woman a constructive force, a weaver of life. He said nothing. He simply turned around and returned to the main house, leaving her to her task. That night, the silence at his dinner table seemed heavier than ever. The sound of life, which Clara brought with her, only made the absence of sound in his own existence even more deafening. He looked at the empty seat before him, the place that had been Helen's, and for the first time, he felt not just the pain of loss, but the acute awareness of the void he himself had cultivated. The presence of that stranger was showing him how dead he was inside, and that was at once frightening and, for a brief moment, hopeful. The main house of Hilltop Ranch was a labyrinth of silent rooms and furniture draped in white sheets. These were guest rooms that never received visitors, living rooms where no one sat, porches where time passed without witnesses. Anthony lived in a small fraction of the house, his bedroom, the office, and the dining room. The rest was a museum of memories he refused to visit. Clara, in her daily cleaning tasks, had explicit orders from Emma's, learned not to touch certain areas, especially the west wing, where the library was. "The boss doesn't like anyone going in there," the old cook warned her, with a look that left no room for questions. But Clara's curiosity wasn't malicious. It was the curiosity of someone who wanted to understand the roots of the silence, the origin of the sadness that hung over that place. One day, while dusting the furniture in the hallway that led to the library, she noticed that the heavy wooden door was ajar. A beam of light from the window streamed through the gap, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, as if inviting her in. Hesitantly, she pushed the door open. The scent of old books and wood filled her lungs. It was a magnificent place, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with leather spines. In the center, a large mahogany table, and at the back, a stone fireplace. But what most caught her attention was a painting easel in the darkest corner of the room. On it, an object covered by a large white linen sheet, like a ghost guarding a secret. Moved by an impulse she couldn't explain, Clara approached. With trembling hands, she pulled at the edge of the fabric. The sheet slid smoothly, revealing the painting beneath. It was the portrait of a woman. She was beautiful, with a serene and melancholic beauty. She had dark hair pulled back in a loose bun, and her deep brown eyes seemed to look directly into the soul of anyone who gazed upon her. There was a faint smile on her lips, but it was a sad smile, like someone who knew pain intimately. Clara felt a pang in her heart. Even without ever having seen her, she knew immediately that this was Helen, Anthony's late wife, the woman who had left a void so vast that no life could flourish around him. She reached out and lightly touched the canvas at the level of the painted face, as if she could console the sadness in those eyes. "Don't touch that." Anthony's voice exploded in the room, a thunderclap that made Clara recoil as if struck. He stood in the doorway, his face transfigured by a fury she had never witnessed. In 2 long strides, he crossed the room, snatched the portrait from her hands with frightening violence, and held it against his chest, as if protecting something sacred. "I didn't know, single quotes," Clara stammered, her heart pounding. "Didn't know what?" "That you shouldn't enter where you weren't invited. That you shouldn't touch what isn't yours," he shouted, his body trembling with rage. "Get out of here. Get out now, and never set foot in this room again. Do you hear me?" His words were like stones. Clara felt tears welling in her eyes, not from fear, but from a deep sadness for having caused such pain, for having invaded such an intimate space. Without another word, she turned and ran from the library, leaving him behind, alone with his ghost. That night, the ranch plunged into an even deeper silence, if that were possible. Clara barely touched her food and retreated early to the small room she had been given in the back of the house. She felt like an intruder, a defiler. The kindness she had tried to spread seemed to have crashed against an insurmountable wall of grief. Perhaps it was time to leave, to go her own way and let that man drown in his own bitterness. Meanwhile, in the main house, Anthony found no peace. After expelling Clara, he replaced the sheet over the portrait and locked the library door. But the image of her, with her hand extended over Helen's face, wouldn't leave his mind. The initial anger gave way to an even worse feeling, guilt. His fury wasn't at Clara, but at himself. It was the fury of a man who couldn't forgive himself. Later, when the house was plunged into darkness, he couldn't bear it. He returned to the library, lit the fireplace, and for the first time in years, removed the sheet from the portrait and gazed at it under the trembling light of the flames. Helen's eyes seemed to accuse him. He remembered the day she died. It hadn't been a long illness, but a stupid accident with a horse, in the same corral where Clara had calmed Gale. That morning they had fought. A terrible argument caused by his sick jealousy, his need for control. The last words he said to her were harsh, unjust. He never had the chance to ask for forgiveness. The Iron Man, the feared boss of Hilltop Ranch, collapsed. He fell to his knees before the fireplace, the portrait in his hands, and the grief he had held for an entire decade finally surfaced. They were dry, ragged sobs, the sound of a soul breaking. He wept for the woman he lost, for the love he himself had poised with his pride, and for the last chance at redemption that fate had denied him. Clara's presence, her kindness, and her light had only made his darkness more apparent, and the pain, which he thought was buried, reignited with the force of a wildfire, consuming everything that remained of his fortress. The days that followed the library incident were charged with a silent tension. Clara avoided crossing Anthony's path at all costs. She went about her tasks with her head down. Her smile and songs had vanished. The joy she had begun to weave into the corners of the ranch seemed to have unraveled, thread by thread. Shame and hurt made her decide, as soon as she had an opportunity, she would leave. That place wasn't for her. That man's pain was too deep an ocean, and she was afraid of drowning. Anthony, in turn, became even more reclusive. He spent his days locked in his office, or riding alone across the far reaches of the property, fleeing the gaze of the ranch hands, and especially himself. The explosion of grief in the library had left him exposed, vulnerable. His iron armor was cracked, and he didn't know how to mend it. He saw Clara from afar, her figure now withdrawn, and felt a discomfort that wasn't anger, but remorse. He wanted to say something, perhaps apologize, but pride was a muzzle over his mouth. How could he, the boss, admit he was wrong? Nature seemed to sense the disharmony of the place. The sky, which had been clear for weeks, began to close in. Heavy, dark, lead-colored clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling in from the mountains. A cold, ominous wind began to blow, kicking up red dust from the ground and whistling through the window cracks. The old-timers looked at the sky and shook their heads. "A fierce storm is coming," they said, and it came. Late in the afternoon, the sky unleashed its fury. It wasn't ordinary rain, but a violent storm, one of those that seemed to want to wash the world clean. Water fell in torrents. Lightning slashed across the sky, and thunder boomed, making the ground tremble. In a few minutes, the dirt paths turned into rivers of mud. The ranch hands ran to take shelter in their cabins, closing doors and windows, praying for the storm to pass quickly. From the main house's porch, Anthony watched nature's fury. The storm outside was a perfect reflection of the chaos within him. Suddenly, one of the ranch hands, Joe, appeared running, soaked from head to toe. His face panicked. "Boss, the new calves. We forgot to move them from the lower corral, near the creek." Anthony felt a cold dread in his stomach. The lower corral was the most vulnerable point on the ranch in case of a flood. The creek, normally a mere trickle, must have already overflowed and flooded everything. The calves, born just weeks ago, wouldn't stand a chance. "Gather the men, we're going there now," he shouted, already grabbing a rain slicker and running towards the door. But Joe shook his head. "No use, boss. It's too dangerous. The current must have already swept away the bridge. No one will risk it." Impatience was poison to Anthony. He couldn't stand by while his animals died. Even if it was madness, he would go alone. He was about to leave when he saw a figure darting through the garden, heading towards the path that led to the flooded corral. It was Clara. She wasn't wearing a slicker, just a shawl over her head, which was useless against the deluge. "Where does that crazy woman think she's going?" he growled, more to himself, and ran after her, fear mixed with reluctant admiration for her courage. When he arrived at the scene, it was desolate. The corral was almost submerged. The muddy, furious water slammed against the fences, threatening to sweep them away. The calves, terrified, huddled on the highest ground, bawling in despair. And there, in the midst of that chaos, with the water already waist-deep, was Clara. She was fighting against the force of the current to open the gate, to give the animals a chance to escape to higher ground. "Clara, get out of there, it's too dangerous," he shouted, trying to make himself heard above the storm's roar. She heard him, but didn't obey. With one last effort, she managed to unlatch the gate. The wood groaned, and the gate swung open. And the calves, guided by instinct, began to file out one by one, towards safety. Clara clung to one of the fence posts to avoid being swept away by the water. She was pale, trembling with cold and exhaustion. Anthony didn't hesitate. He waded into the icy water and went to her. The current's force was brutal, but he was strong. He reached her, gripped her arm firmly and pulled her close. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice firm, protective. He guided her back to dry land. When they arrived, drenched and breathless, she collapsed into his arms, trembling uncontrollably. He wrapped his slicker around her, an instinctive gesture, and held her for a moment. There, under the torrential rain, with thunder echoing all around, something broke inside him. All the anger, all the pride, all the distrust he felt for her dissolved in the downpour. What remained was the sight of that fragile yet courageous woman, who risked her own life to save his animals, to protect what was his. For the first time in years, Anthony's hard gaze became human. He saw no intruder, no threat. He saw only Clara, and in that moment, amidst the storm, he felt an overwhelming need to protect her, not just from the rain, but from everything, including himself. The storm falling from the sky was violent, but the one that had calmed in his chest was, by far, the most significant. The stormy night marked a turning point at Hilltop Ranch. After taking Clara to the main house, Anthony ordered Mrs. Lourdes to prepare a hot bath and dry clothes for her. He himself made her drink a hot broth in the kitchen, watching in silence as she, still trembling, held the bowl with both hands. There were no formal apologies, no grand speeches. Words were not Anthony's strength, but the care in his gestures, the worried look he could no longer hide, spoke louder than any sentence. From that day on, the dynamic between them changed. The tension dissipated, giving way to a mutual curiosity. Anthony, who once watched her from a distance with suspicion, now sought her out. It began with simple pretexts. He asked her to accompany him to check a broken fence or to see a new litter of pigs. These were excuses to keep her close, to hear her voice. Clara, in turn, felt that the wall around him had crumbled. She no longer felt like an intruder. She saw in the gruff man a glimpse of vulnerability, a sadness he could no longer hide, and instead of fearing him, she felt a deep compassion. Their walks became routine. He took her to see parts of the ranch that even the oldest hands rarely visited. He showed her the source of the creek that cut through the property, a peaceful spot with ferns and moss-covered stones. He showed her the old coffee grove, abandoned since Helen's death, where the trees still bore fruit, gathered only by the birds. During these outings, they talked. At first about ranch matters, harvest time, the health of the cattle, the pests that attacked the cornfield. Gradually, their conversations became more personal. He, with difficulty, spoke of his father, the man who built that empire, but who never had time for his son. Clara spoke of her childhood, of a rootless life, moving from town to town with a family that never settled anywhere. She didn't tell everything. A part of her story remained veiled, but what she shared was enough for him to understand the strength that lay behind her fragile appearance. "Did you never want a place to call your own?" he asked once, as they watched the sunset from a hilltop, painting the fields a golden hue. Clara smiled, a melancholy smile. "I suppose you learn to carry your home inside you. But sometimes it gets tiring. Sometimes you just want a spot to plant your feet and say, 'I'm not leaving here anymore.'" Her answer struck him deeply. He, who had so much land, so many acres, felt more lost and rootless than she did. The ranch, as if by magic, seemed to respond to this new harmony. Things started to go right. The corn harvest, which promised to be meager, turned out to be the most abundant in years. The mare, everyone thought barren, gave birth to a strong, healthy foal. The ranch hands, seeing the change in their boss's mood, worked more happily, more motivated. The sound of a fiddle returned to be heard in the workers' cabins at dusk. Life was, indeed, returning to Hilltop Ranch. Mars Lertz, the old cook, watched everything with a knowing smile. "That girl is a blessing," she'd say to anyone who'd listen. "She came to heal this home." Anthony also felt this healing. He began to rediscover the beauty of his own lands through Clara's eyes. She marveled at things he no longer even noticed. The patterns the clouds formed in the sky, the scent of wet earth after a light rain, the way fireflies lit up the night. With her, he relearned to see. One morning, he took her to the orchard. The wild plum trees were laden, their trunks dark with so much fruit. He watched her climb the tree barefoot, with the agility of a girl, and laugh as she delighted in the fruit. The sound of her laughter, clear and genuine, echoed through the orchard and found a direct path to his heart. In that moment he realized he couldn't remember the last time he had heard such pure laughter. He couldn't remember the last time he himself had smiled. He approached the tree, and without a word, picked a wild plum and put it to his mouth. The sweet, familiar taste of the fruit was the same as always, but that day it seemed different. It tasted of something new, of a fresh start. He looked at Clara, who smiled at him from high on the branch, her mouth stained purple, and felt something he had long believed dead, a flicker of happiness. The relationship between them still had no name. It wasn't a romance, nor a common friendship. It was a meeting of two lonely souls who, together, found a way to mend their broken pieces. In the golden fields of Hilltop Ranch, under the watchful eye of the sun, a new seed began to sprout, watered by hope and the promise that even the harshest winter can, one day, give way to spring. While spring blossomed in Anthony's soul and across the ranch fields, a shadow began to deepen in the darker corners of Hilltop Ranch. That shadow had a name, Ben, the foreman, who for over 20 years had been Anthony's right-hand man. His eyes and ears watched the boss's transformation with a feeling that mixed contempt and fear. He didn't see Clara's arrival as a blessing, but as a direct threat to his position and power. Ben was a man of few words, but cunning thoughts. He had built his career on the ranch using two tools: canine loyalty to the boss and the imposition of fear on the other ranch hands. In Anthony's arid and silent universe, Ben was king. He was the one who assigned tasks, who decided punishments, who carried and brought information. The other workers feared him almost as much as they feared Anthony himself. It was a power he savored, a control that gave him a sense of importance. With Clara's arrival, that house of cards began to crumble. The young woman didn't fit into his power structure. She didn't fear him. On the contrary, she treated him with the same kindness and respect she showed everyone, and for Ben, this was an affront. Even worse was seeing the influence she exerted over Anthony. The boss, who once only listened to him, now spent hours walking and talking with the stranger. Orders, which Ben used to give after a brief conversation with Anthony, now often came directly from the boss, with an added note: that was Clara's idea. Jealousy and envy began to gnaw at Ben from within. He saw his power slipping away, his relevance diminishing. Each smile Anthony directed at Clara was a stab to his pride. Every improvement on the ranch, which everyone attributed to the young woman's presence, was in his eyes a testament to his own incompetence. He needed to do something to reverse the situation, to get that woman out of his way and restore the old order. Ben's strategy was subtle, poisonous. He began to plant seeds of distrust among the other workers. He didn't openly speak ill of Clara. Instead, he used the weapon of insinuation. "Strange, don't you think?" he'd comment to a group of ranch hands as he sharpened a knife. "This girl shows up out of nowhere like a ghost, and suddenly the boss, who used to be tougher than an old oak, turns into a lamb. Odd business, that." To others, he used superstition, fertile ground in the simple minds of many field workers. "They say some women have a gift for charming men. They tie their minds with strong prayers, with spells. We have to be careful," he'd say, with an air of one who knows hidden secrets. Little by little the poison began to take effect. Some ranch hands, especially those who felt overlooked or harbored some resentment, began to look at Clara with suspicion. Conversations ceased when she approached. Smiles became rarer. The harmonies she had built with so much effort began to show small cracks. Clara felt the change in the air. She didn't understand why, but she noticed the sidelong glances, the whispers that died when she passed. This saddened her, but she was strong. She continued her work, her routine, believing that truth and kindness would prevail. Ben's main target, however, was Anthony himself. He knew the boss better than anyone. He knew his pride, his innate distrust, the open wound left by Helen's death, and that's where he intended to strike. He waited for the right moment. One afternoon, when Anthony was particularly irritated by a cattle deal that had fallen through, Ben approached him with his usual posture of a loyal servant. "Boss seems troubled," he began, his voice soft. "Just business, Ben. Nothing for you to worry about," Anthony replied curtly. "It's just I worry about you, sir." "About the ranch," the foreman continued, feigning hesitation. "People are talking, You know how simple folks are, right? Attached to old beliefs." Anthony stopped what he was doing and stared at him. "Talking about what, Ben? Spill it." "Ah, boss. It's about the young woman, Clara," he said, lowering his voice as if sharing a dangerous secret. "Folks are saying she has some trick up her sleeve, that since she arrived, you've changed, that you're not the same anymore. They say she might have cast some kind of spell to tame you and take over everything." Anthony was silent for a long moment. A part of him, the rational part, the part that had been touched by Clara's light, wanted to laugh at such nonsense, such ignorant superstition. He wanted to tell Ben to mind his own business and stop spreading gossip. But another part of him, the dark part, the wounded and proud part, hesitated. The change in him had indeed been swift and profound. He himself barely understood it. Clara's influence over him was undeniable. Could it be that he, the Iron Man, was being manipulated? The seed of doubt, skillfully planted by Ben's envy, found fertile ground in Anthony's tormented soul. And once planted, the weed of distrust would begin to grow, silent and deadly, threatening to choke the fragile flower that had barely begun to bloom. The seed planted by Ben didn't germinate immediately. In the days that followed, Anthony tried to ignore the insinuation, classifying it as foolishness, a fruit of people's superstition. He continued his routine with Clara, their walks, their conversations. But something had changed. Doubt, like a slow poison, had begun to infiltrate his thoughts. He found himself watching Clara with a different gaze, more analytical, almost investigative. Every gesture of kindness from her, which once disarmed him, was now filtered through distrust. When she suggested a new pasture rotation for the cattle, a brilliant idea he hadn't thought of himself, he wondered, is she truly intelligent, or is she just showing me what I want to see to gain my trust? When she calmed one of the ranch hands who had been injured, with serene words and an herbal tea she learned from her grandmother, he thought, is this compassion or an act to make everyone see her as a saint? Ben, realizing his first strike had taken effect, continued his undermining work. He no longer needed to speak directly. He simply created small situations that fed Anthony's doubt. One day, one of the ranch's most valuable horses fell ill. The veterinarian from the neighboring town couldn't diagnose the problem. The animal was visibly weakening. Clara, who had a deep knowledge of herbs, asked Anthony for permission to treat the horse with natural remedies. "These are things I learnt on the road, sir." "It's worth a try," she said, with her usual sincerity. Anthony, desperate to save the animal, consented. Clara spent 2 days and 2 nights beside the horse, applying compresses, giving it teas, and talking to it in whispers. On the 3rd day, to everyone's astonishment, the horse stood up, stronger, and began to eat. Its recovery was considered a miracle. While most of the ranch hands celebrated, Ben approached Anthony with a somber air. "It's impressive, isn't it, boss? She has a power, ... that's not of this world, curing an animal that even the doctor couldn't fix, ... That's not something an ordinary person does." The word power echoed in Anthony's mind. He looked at Clara, who was stroking the recovered horse, and instead of feeling gratitude, he felt a chill. What was this? Knowledge or witchcraft? A gift or manipulation? The poison of doubt began to affect his behavior. He became more distant, more silent. Walks with Clara became rarer, and when they happened, they were filled with an uncomfortable silence. He questioned her about her past, about where she had learned so many things. But his questions were no longer driven by curiosity, but by suspicion. Clara felt his distancing like a physical blow. The connection they had built was crumbling, and she didn't understand why. "Did I do something wrong, sir?" she asked one night, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know, Clara. You tell me," he replied, his voice cold as ice. "Sometimes I wonder who you really are." The veiled accusation wounded her deeply. She, who had opened herself to him, who had shown him the purest part of her soul, was now seen as a fraud. Ben's final blow was the cruelest. He knew the importance of Helen's portrait to Anthony. He knew that was his deepest wound. One morning he found a small sprig of rue, an herb popularly associated with protection rituals and breaking spells, lying near the library door. He ran, breathless, to show Anthony. "Boss, look what I found," he said, his voice laden with false concern. It was right there, by the library door. "The folks in the cabin say Clara is always messing with these herbs. Could it be?" Could she have been trying to do something with Maud's? Helen's memories. That was the spark that ignited the powder keg of Anthony's distrust. The idea that Clara might be using her spells to desecrate the memory of his late wife, to erase the past and install herself in her place, was unbearable. Old pain mingled with new distrust, creating a monster of jealousy and rage. He didn't question Ben's story. He didn't consider that the foreman might have planted the herb there. Doubt had already blinded him completely. In his mind, all the pieces fit: the mysterious arrival, the command over animals, the influence over people, the miraculous healing of the horse, and now the attempt to tamper with the sacred. Everything seemed part of an elaborate plan. He harbored his anger all day, letting it grow within him. Clara's image, once a source of peace, was now the image of a traitor, a witch who had deceived him with her false sweetness. He needed to confront her, needed to tear off the mask, and see the face of the woman who, he now believed, had come to destroy what little he had left. The storm brewing in his heart was far more devastating than the one that had fallen upon the ranch weeks earlier, and he knew that when it broke, the words he would say to Clara would be as sharp as lightning. Night fell over Hilltop Ranch, but it brought no peace. The atmosphere was charged, heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Anthony didn't dine. He remained in his office, fueling his fury with sips of whiskey, his mind swirling with Ben's accusations and his own insecurities. Every memory of Clara's kindness was now twisted and reinterpreted as an act of manipulation. The trust she had built with such care was in ruins, demolished by distrust. He sent for her. The message was delivered by Mrs. Lurds, whose worried expression betrayed that something very wrong was about to happen. Clara felt her stomach clench. She knew that summons wasn't for a friendly chat. With a heavy heart but a clear conscience, she knocked on the office door. "Enter." Anthony's voice sounded muffled, different. When she entered, the scene startled her. He stood near the window, looking out into the darkness. A glass was in his hand, and the strong smell of alcohol permeated the air. The room, normally lit only by a lamp, was plunged into gloom, warmed only by the dying embers in the fireplace. It was there, in that very place, that he had collapsed in grief for his wife. Now, the same room was the stage for a different kind of pain, that of the betrayal he believed he had suffered. He turned to face her, and her eyes met his. They were dark, cold, devoid of all the warmth she had begun to see in them. "Finally, we're going to have an honest conversation, Clara." "No masks," he began, his voice drawn out. "Dangerous." "I never wore a mask with you, sir," she replied, her voice firm despite the fear she felt. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "No? Then tell me, what do you want from me? What do you want from this place? Money? Land? Or the pleasure of seeing a man made a fool of?" The accusations hit her like a punch. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir. I only wanted to help. Only wanted to bring some life back here." "Life," he repeated, approaching her, his body emanating an aura of threat. "You call this life? This circus you've staged? Calming horses with your tricks, curing ailments with your potions, enchanting everyone with your false sweetness. Answer me," he growled, his voice rising. "What have you done to me?" The last question came out almost as a lament, a confession of his own vulnerability. He was furious not just with her, but with himself for having allowed himself to feel, for having let down his guard. Clara felt tears welling up, but held them back. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She stared him down, eye to eye, her hurt lending her a courage she didn't know she possessed. "What did I do to you, sir? I did nothing. I only showed you what was already inside, the kindness you buried along with your wife, the ability to smile you forgot you had, the heart you stopped listening to." Her words, full of truth, enraged him even more, because deep down he knew they were true. "Don't you dare speak of my wife," he yelled, pointing a finger at her face. "You're not even worthy of cleaning the ground she walked on. She was a real woman, pure, not some ... some wanderer who uses spells to deceive others and get what she wants." The word spells confirmed Clara's suspicions. Someone was poisoning him. Someone had planted that absurd idea in his head. But there was no point defending herself. He wouldn't listen. He was blind with distrust and pain. The words he uttered next were the cruelest, those that cut deeper than any whip. He accused her of being a schemer, of having a plan to take over the ranch, of having desecrated Helen's memory with her deceptions. Each sentence was a blow, destroying the image he himself had helped to rebuild of himself. The man who had saved her from the storm was now drowning her in a sea of unjust accusations. When he finally stopped, breathless, expecting a reaction, a desperate denial, Clara merely looked at him with immense sadness. Tears now streamed freely down her face, but her voice came out clear, without a hint of hesitation. "I could spend the entire night trying to prove you wrong, but I won't. Do you know why? Because I don't fear your contempt, sir. I've known contempt before. I only fear that you'll forget what you saw in yourself when you looked at me for the first time." She paused, letting the sentence hang in the heavy air of the room. "You're not angry with me. You're afraid. Afraid to feel again. Afraid to live again. And it's easier to blame me, to turn me into a monster, than to admit that fear. May you keep your silence and your loneliness. It seems that's all you think you deserve, DUSK." Single quotes, without waiting for a reply. She turned and left the office, closing the door softly behind her. The sound of the lock clicking shut was the sound of something definitively breaking between them. Anthony stood still, alone in the gloom, her words echoing in his mind. The fury drained away, leaving behind only an icy void and the bitter taste of his own poison. He had succeeded. He had driven away the light. And the darkness that enveloped him afterward was deeper and more solitary than ever. The days that followed that terrible night were like a return to Hilltop Ranch's darkest past. Silence reigned once more, but now it was a heavy silence, laden with hurt and unspoken words. Clara retreated into herself. She performed her duties mechanically, the sparkle in her eyes extinguished. She no longer sang, no longer smiled, no longer conversed with the animals. She was like a flower that, after an unexpected frost, had withered. She slowly packed her small bundle of clothes, determined to leave as soon as the rain subsided and the road was better. Anthony, in turn, retreated back into his iron armor, but it no longer fit him as it once had. The cracks were there, and the loneliness, once his constant companion, now suffocated him. He tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing, that he had protected himself from a great disappointment, but Clara's last words wouldn't leave his head. "You're afraid." The truth contained in that sentence haunted him during the day and stole his sleep at night. The ranch, which had begun to flourish, seemed to wither along with Clara's spirit. Everything seemed gray, lifeless. Ben, the foreman, was the only one who seemed satisfied. With Clara neutralized, he felt his power was restored. He reverted to treating the ranch hands with his usual arrogance, giving sharp orders, feeling like the true master of the place. And it was precisely this arrogance that led to his downfall. Anthony, tormented and restless, began to do something he hadn't done in a long time: pay attention to details. With his mind free from the distraction, that was Clara. He began to notice small inconsistencies in the ranch's administration. A feed bill that seemed too high, a settler's complaint about poor quality seeds, a calf that vanished from the pasture without explanation. Things he would have overlooked before, blindly trusting Ben, now jumped out at him. Distrust, previously aimed at Clara, began to shift its target. He decided to investigate on his own. One night, instead of locking himself in his office, he went to the barn where supplies were stored. Hidden in the shadows, he saw Ben meet with a merchant from the neighboring town. The conversation was low, but Anthony heard enough. Ben was selling bags of fertilizer and seeds from the ranch on the side, pocketing the money and replacing the material with inferior products. The sick animals, the weaker harvests. Everything started to make sense. It wasn't bad luck, it was sabotage. The fury that consumed Anthony was different from what he had felt with Clara. It wasn't a blind rage, fueled by pain and jealousy. It was a cold, calculated fury, the fury of a man who realized the extent of the betrayal he had suffered. He understood everything. The gossip, the insinuations about witchcraft, the sprig of rue by the library door. It had all been a smokescreen, a cruel maneuver by Ben to divert attention from his own crimes, using Clara as a scapegoat. The next morning, Anthony summoned Ben to his office. The foreman entered with his usual subservient air, suspecting nothing. "Ben, I need you to explain some accounts to me," Anthony said, throwing the ledgers onto the table. "It seems we're spending a lot and producing little. You, my trusted man, should know why." Ben began to stammer, inventing excuses about the drought, about pests, but Anthony cut him off. "Don't lie to me, Ben," he said, his voice low and lethal. "I saw you last night. I know about your dealings with Joe from the general store. I know about the theft. I know everything." Ben's face went pale. He tried to deny it, but Anthony's gaze, hard as steel, silenced him. The mask of the loyal servant fell, revealing the face of a petty and envious man. "It was because of her, wasn't it?" Anthony continued, his voice laden with disgust. "You couldn't stand to see her gain my trust, a trust you never deserved. You used her, slandered her, poisoned my mind against the only person who brought some light to this place in years. All of it for greed, for power." Anthony stood up, his imposing figure filling the room. "Get out of my sight. Pack your things and disappear from my lands. And if I hear your name in this region again, I swear you'll regret the day you were born." Ben, defeated and humiliated, left the office without a word. The foreman's expulsion spread across the ranch like wildfire. But for Anthony, that was no victory. It was the confirmation of his monumental error, the realization of the wrong he had done. Clara hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. He hadn't just misjudged her. He had crucified her to protect a traitor. That very night, with a heart heavy with guilt, he went looking for her. The full moon lit the fields, transforming the landscape into silver and shadow. He searched the house, the garden, the chapel. He didn't find her. A cold panic began to grip him. Had she left? Had he lost her forever? Then he remembered the place she loved most, the creek's source, a place of peace. He ran, his chest burning, the need to ask for forgiveness, the only force moving him. He found her there, sitting on a rock by the water's edge. The moonlight bathed her face, revealing the silent trails of tears. In her lap, she was mending a tear in her old skirt, the same one she wore when she arrived. That simple gesture of mending what was torn seemed to Anthony the perfect metaphor for everything she had done in his life, trying to fix what time pain and pride had destroyed. And he, in his blindness, had torn the most precious fabric of all, her trust. Anthony stopped a few paces away, the sound of his feet on the dry leaves making Clara look up. For an instant, fear flickered in her eyes, the memory of his fury still vivid. But the man standing there, under the moonlight, was not the same one from the office. His posture was not one of arrogance, but of brokenness. His eyes didn't burn with anger, but shone with deep regret. He approached slowly, like one approaching a frightened animal. And then, to Clara's utter astonishment, the man who never bowed to anyone, the owner of those lands, the feared boss of Hilltop Ranch, knelt on the damp earth before her. It wasn't a gesture of desperate pleading, but of surrender. A surrender to the truth, to his own fallibility, to the feeling he had tried so hard to deny. Clara ... single quotes, he began, his voice hoarse, choked. There are no words that can fix what I did. There's no excuse for my blindness, for my cruelty. He told her everything. About Ben's betrayal, about the lies, about how he let himself be poisoned by doubt, because it was easier to believe in evil than to accept good. You were right, he continued, his gaze fixed on the ground, unable to meet her eyes. I was afraid. Fear made me a small man, a cruel man. For years I used silence and harshness as a shield to hide my cowardice, the cowardice of not being able to forgive myself. And when you arrived, with your light, with your strength, ... you showed me that it was possible to live again, and that terrified me. I destroyed the most beautiful thing that had happened to me in years because I didn't think I was worthy of it. Clara listened in silence, tears streaming uncontrollably. They were tears of sadness for all they had been through, but also of relief, of understanding. The wound his words had opened began slowly to heal. When he finished speaking, a deep silence settled between them, filled only by the soft sound of water running in the creek and the chirping of crickets. Then Clara made a simple gesture. She placed the hand not holding the needle on his hand, which rested on his own knee. It was a light touch, but laden with meaning. There were no words, just the contact. A gesture of forgiveness, of acceptance, of a new beginning. Anthony raised his face and finally their eyes met. In that gaze all the pain, all the hurt, and all the loneliness dissolved. Time seemed to stop. The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of wild grass and wet earth. In the distance, a horse's whinny echoed through the night, not a sound of despair, as on the day they met, but a sound of freedom, of life. And there, under the blessing of the full moon, two broken souls finally found each other a whole. The conclusion of this story didn't come with a passionate kiss or a declaration of love, but with the arrival of the harvest. The weeks that followed were filled with hard work and a quiet rebuilding. Clara didn't leave, she stayed, and her presence, now solidified by respect and affection, became the soul of the ranch. The lands of Hilltop Ranch flourished as never before. Golden cornfields swayed in the wind, promising a record harvest. The orchard was laden with fruit, and the well-tended cattle grazed happily. The local folks commented, with a smile, that even the sun seemed to have made peace with that ranch. Anthony transformed. The feared man gave way to a respected man. He learned to smile, a smile that began in his eyes and lit up his tired face. He learned to listen to his ranch hands, to ask for advice, to govern with justice and not with fear. And, most importantly, he learned to love. He and Clara didn't need labels. They were companions. On foggy mornings, they walked side by side through the fields, planning the day, sharing dreams, or simply enjoying each other's presence. His gaze was no longer that of a man who owned land, but of someone who had finally found his place in the world, his ground. On the day of the great harvest festival, with the entire ranch gathered, with fiddle music, abundant food, and laughter echoing everywhere, Anthony took Clara's hand. Before everyone, he said nothing. He simply looked at her with such profound gratitude and love that no words could express it. And she smiled back, the smile that had brought life back to that place. Together, they were proof that even the most arid soil can flourish when watered with patience, forgiveness, and above all, with the courage to allow oneself to feel again. So, did you like how this story ended? Anthony and Clara's journey teaches us that it's never too late to forgive, to change, and to let the light in. If this message touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Leave a like so we know you were here with us, and of course, comment on what you liked most about this ending. Your participation is what makes all this worthwhile. A big hug, and see you next time.